It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to say on behalf of all the speakers how well organised this event is and what great work you and your colleagues are doing, highlighting the importance of focusing on well-being, its link to productivity, etc. And the great thing is that we've all got the capacity to change. Julian is a great example of this. I first met him in the late 1980s. He was at school with my brother, who's in the audience. And the first time we met, Damien brought him down to Cobham, where we used to play rugby as medical students. And he was naturally welcomed in with open arms, given too much to drink. And the flow he had there was beer. He became very mindless, not mindful. And I ended up having to care for him. So some of today's themes are all coming together. Joking aside, how effective are we? Let's just have a quick straw poll in the room. Just put your hand up in the work situation if you would say that on average you are 25% of your time or more effective. Just put your hand up for me. So pretty much everybody. We'll come back to those who aren't. Put your hand up now if you are effective, let's say 50% of the time or more. So we're down to about a third, maybe a half. Someone's on the borderline. Hand up if you're over 75% of the time. So we got one fantastic standout person. Hands up if it's less than 25% of the time. Okay, nobody. And that's very interesting because research shows that on average in the workplace, we're about 53 to 55% on-task focused. So that's not bad, but also it's not great. There's capacity there to improve what we do. And we use analogies from the sporting world because a lot of the work that we do with sportsmen and women, as we've heard earlier today, is all about how effective they are at recovery. They're good at what they do because they allow themselves time to recover. That also allows them to be more mentally effective. So what I'd like to do is just step you through relatively quickly these three areas because they're all linked. We know that flow is this state of being totally absorbed in something that really grabs us. It has to be a challenge. It has to be something that we are able to do. And there's a sense of time passing by without us really noticing, and our attention is really quite closely tied into what's happening. If we look at a very simple diagrammatic explaining what states we're often in, at home, at work, wherever, we get these four areas. And I think we can all agree that if we are distracted, in other words, not very focused, and we're not thinking about our awareness, in other words, the bottom left-hand corner, we're in what we might call a mindless state. It happens when we're watching TV, we're not listening to people. And my argument would be if we could move away from that state into any of these other three areas, flow, which I'll come on to talk about, mindfulness, which you've heard brilliant stuff about already from Paul, and he gave us an example of how beneficial that is and how simple it is to apply. And also creativity. In creativity, we're not as focused, but we have a good open awareness that allows ideas to bubble up, and people working in creative areas have to have that as an essential state. If we're thinking about how to go from bottom left to any of those other areas, we need to tackle this, and it's stress, it's pressure, it's how we interact with what's going on. It's great to be able to, if you work with the guys at the Wanderlust Academy, carve out an hour for exercise at 12, 50 minutes on the way into work to plan your day and do some mindfulness. But in the real world, that doesn't apply to all of us. It would be great if it would, that should be our goal, but it doesn't. And so what do? We have to understand that in response to stress, two very important brain areas get affected. Our prefrontal cortex, the front end there, the bit that marks us out from the mammals, it gets turned off when we're under stress. And our limbic system, our fight or flight system, gets dialed up. And unfortunately, that makes focus very difficult for us. So what can we do about it? Here's a very simple diagram to explain what we as scientists or psychologists would understand by stress. Fight or flight. In this situation, the person, or the animal I should say, that's under stress is the zebra. Actually the lioness is as well, because if she doesn't kill the zebra, she misses out on lunch, and her young as well do. So this response happens as much in us as it does in the animal world. And what happens is that in this moment, the zebra's attention is heightened, releases energy to allow it to run away, and the focus is very, very sharp. Escape, survival, it's a hardwired response, and we have this as well. If we fast forward 5 minutes, there's two possible scenarios. You've probably got David Attenborough saying, and so here we see the lioness with her young feeding. A good day, the poor zebra's been killed. But equally, we may hear him say, the zebra, with help from the herd, has managed to escape, and the zebra's now having the lunch. And that's very important because that fight or flight response that we've all got is about survival. And in the olden days, when we were foraging and trying to kill for our food, that was great. Sadly, the game has changed. Many of these on the board, I'm sure you would relate to. These are workplace-based stressors. The question is, how many of these stressors are helped with a fight or flight neurobiological response? Yes, it might be nice to shout down the phone at the IT support help desk for the 4th time in the day because it makes you feel better, but does it deal with the stress? No, it doesn't. Yes, it might be nice to run out the door, jump on the tube, go home, hide under the duvet because of looming deadlines. Does it help you with the stress? Of course it doesn't. And worse than this, we know that exposed to stress over a long time, when it's not acute, which we can deal with pretty effectively, when it's chronic, it will start to affect our health. So we know that the zebra won't fatigue quickly apart from physically. Mentally it won't do, but humans will. We know that zebras don't make emotional decisions, but we do. We also know that zebras probably don't feel overwhelmed after that passing event. And zebras are unlikely to develop health problems. And the reason for that is to do with their brain and how it actually operates, because they can't hold on to those memories of those difficult or traumatic events. So as David Attenborough says, 5 minutes later, the zebra is chewing and having its lunch. Zebras don't get ulcers and they don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. That is well recognized, well known. But we do. Human stress these days is predominantly psychological. We have the ability to pack it up and carry it around with us wherever we go. We all love things that are free, stress is free, and we love things that are portable. It's portable. So if you take me as an example, I was asked 6 weeks ago to give this talk, something like that, 2 months. And I've got the ability to start to worry about that talk from 6 weeks ago. I then start engaging in preparing and getting it ready. I can think about it. It can make me anxious. I can be here today, and I'm naturally anxious, as we have beautifully described and demonstrated by Paul earlier. Those physical manifestations of that stress response naturally happen. Not only that, depending on how things go, if I don't think I've done a good job, I can worry about this and remember a bad experience and carry that stress with me. So do applaud loudly at the end. Thank you. But let's see if I can just demonstrate how easy it is to trigger a stress response in all of us sat here comfortably in the room. I'm going to play a video. I just want you to watch it. Just have a think about how you feel watching the video. Did anyone enjoy watching that? Lunatic. Did anyone notice themselves start to feel a little bit tense? Nodding heads. Anyone notice their heart rate start to go up slightly? Hands up if you like heights. Hands up if you don't like heights. Okay, the people with their hands up, would you like me to play that again, or should we just leave it there? So the point is that we are all sat in a comfortable room, hosted by Julian in a very, very nice way, on a solid floor. We're not at risk, and yet we can see a video and we can trigger our stress response. That's how easy it is to get into a stress cycle. And because of that, we need to understand the impact of stress, chronic stress over time. Psychologists know that not all stress is bad. So as a little vignette, when I qualified as a doctor, I had a couple of months to kill before I was going to be working in training as a psychiatrist, and I wasn't working. And I was playing a lot of rugby at a high level, so I was physically fit, I was well. But in the course of that 2 months, because I was no longer under stress, because the stress levels had come down, my performance dropped right down here. I was actually sharing at the time a house with my brother, and he'll remember he was working in the city, getting up at 5:45 in the morning, and I would hear him go, and I'd lounge in bed till 9:30. I'd get up. The highlight of the day was by the Evening Standard, go down the road, get something to eat. So this was someone physically fit, certainly not mentally unwell, I don't think, and yet the impact on performance of removing a demand or a stressful routine was significant. And here's the difficult part. Most of us are not that smart. Most of us think when we're under pressure, we work a bit harder, we'll get ourselves out of trouble, we'll work ourselves out of there. So we hope that we've got this intended line of performance. Work a bit more, get a bit more done. But of course the reality is everybody has a tipping point. And when we work too hard, or when we're exposed to stress on a chronic basis without recovery, either nutrition, sleep, all of the important things we've been hearing about today, we find ourselves moving into these phases. The first is fatigue, then we get exhaustion, ill health, and eventually breakdown. What we have to do in those early stages is take our foot off the gas, pay attention to our recovery behaviours, and allow ourselves to recover. So if I said to the audience, if I said to all of you, there is a way of shifting that tipping point, moving it from here to up here, so we can cope with stress better and continue to perform, would that be of interest? Maybe. Of course it would. We call this psychological resilience. And the first thing we have to recognise is that we cannot do anything about the stress in the environment. If I go into a company, if I'm talking to a group of bankers, lawyers, management consultants, their L&D and HR people get very nervous thinking we're going to come in and say, work is bad for you, do less work. Can't do that, you lose your job. But the good news is we can all be trained to be more effective in the way we deal with stress. And our definition of resilience involves these three things. When under pressure, we keep stress in proportion. We stay focused when we're under pressure. And very importantly, after a period of pressure, we give ourselves the time, the nutrition, the rest, the sleep, all the things we need to recover properly. If you think about people who are good at working under pressure, military, accident emergency staff, emergency services, some business leaders, a lot of elite sports people, the reality is they've learnt these skills. And that's the reason why. There's probably about 10% of the population who have got a very healthy genetic makeup and grew up in families where they are imbued with natural resilience. The rest of us have to develop it and have to learn it. The good news is we can, but we have to work on one thing in particular, and that's our thinking style. So what do we do? Psychologists would help people in this way with approaches that began probably 30 years ago. People refer to it as cognitive behavioral work or related approaches. And essentially it works like this. Something happens, we'll call it the activating event. And as a result of that, let's say it was some bad news at work, or one of your children is sick, there'd be a set of consequences. And these can be physiological, they can be emotional, they can be behavioral. Not all of them would be good. So the stress response is the physiology, what happens to your heart rate, what happens to your breathing rate, how do you feel physically. But then how do you behave as well? Now the reality is, if everybody reacted in the same way, we could conclude that A leads to C. But take a common or garden example, two people on the same train going to work to a very, very, very important business meeting with a client. The train stops with no announcement. There's no idea of what's going on. One of them calmly takes out laptop and starts to work. The other sits there fretting, worrying about what might happen. What will the client think? What will the feedback be? What could that do to my appraisal? Where will this end up? It could be a disaster. Same activating event, very different consequences. And that's because we shape or filter those responses through our beliefs, our perceptions of how the world operates. And that's the area that we work on with individuals on a one-to-one basis or in workshops to help them improve. What we need to start by doing is thinking about our thinking, understanding what's happening for us. Paul talked earlier about standing back and reflecting on our emotional states. We would encourage people to think about their thinking. And in so doing, identify what we call the common mind traps. Here are 5 of them. The first one, just nod lightly if you recognize this. Catastrophizing. Something bad happens, but you fast forward to the worst possible outcome. Your child is a bit sick at home and you assume the child's going to be sick for 3 days. You're not going to be able to get cover for your child. You're not going to be able to get into work. As a result of that, you're going to be bad-mouthed at work, etc., etc. Just fast forwarding to a bad outcome. Personalization, taking things personally. Anything that's happened has a particular bearing on you. Shoulds, I'm a very strong should. Should is that set of rules by which we believe that things should be done in a certain way. And we should do them in that way, and other people should also do them in that way. Nodding in the middle of the room. Mind reading. Anyone do this? Someone tells you something or some non-verbal communication, but you know the real meaning of what they're thinking because you can read their minds. We all like that. And then finally, all or nothing thinking. So as an example, some of these traits or thinking styles are actually quite helpful. My wife, who was a corporate lawyer in the city, she's a very strong all or nothing, black or white thinker. Things have to be just so. Now, if you're reviewing a 150-page document on behalf of a client that's going to avoid or lead to litigation, you absolutely need to be black and white in how you analyse what's in there, assess it and look at it. If you're at home at the weekend negotiating with our 14-year-old daughter about what time she comes home from her party, black or white thinking is a disaster. You've got to have some flexibility. And I was reflecting, Javed, if you don't mind, I was reflecting on your experience of that young boy that you couldn't save. And readily I see that you, in that situation, very high on shoulds, you set yourself this fixed rule, must not ever let someone die or alone, so you must be with them. It's a fixed rule. And that concrete, that fixed way we look at things sets us up a little to be stressed. And then also all or nothing. It's got to be this, I must only do that. So the combination of those two things, I believe, might sit behind some of the baggage that you're carrying now. And what you would do in an exercise is you get people to work through particular scenarios they're familiar with that might be challenging for them and assess where they're at on this scale. And having done that, you then get to the stage where you help them to check, challenge, and change. The last part is the hardest. Most of us don't like judging our own thoughts. So we often say to people, don't imagine it's you, imagine it's a friend. How do you help a friend to move forward with this situation? That allows you to step back from it and actually challenge it quite effectively. Finally, on to flow. So we're hoping to move from mindlessness into flow. As you can see from the diagram, focus is absolutely critical. One of the key things in terms of flow is having a challenge, but the challenge is within your capabilities. You're not setting yourself up so much that you can't get there. Hands up in the room if you multitask. And keep your hands up if you find that an effective way of working. Okay, poor deluded fools, come and see me later. The reality is that we've evolved ways of thinking, cognitive strategies that allow us to focus on one thing at a time. We think we're focusing on 2 or 3 things, but we have to task shift every time we move from something to something else. Some of the time that's a useful way of working because you're juggling things, but most of the time it's inefficient, it's tiring, and it will actually lead to less efficiency. So we need to find ways of not multitasking. And here I'm going to share with you some very basic practical points. Anyone heard of the Pomodoro technique? It simply means getting a timer and setting 20 to 30 minutes as your activity to focus on one thing. Switch off your phone, don't look at emails, don't take your messages, just focus on one thing. You'd be amazed at how much your productivity would go up. Things like scheduling meetings for 45 minutes rather than an hour, allowing yourself time to wrap up, debrief, get on to the next thing, but also perhaps have 5 minutes of downtime to yourself to look at some mindfulness techniques. Making those clear priorities, Julian, you've set that out very nicely, how beneficial that is. And then if we can distinguish between urgent and important tasks. And finally, this is what we were talking about before, Javed, it's okay to be good enough. Perfection, that black and white thinking, really sets us up as hostage to fortunes. But as with all these things, and I know this is a very intelligent audience, so the challenge to you is take some of this away and put it into practice. Thank you very much.